August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Japanese Lieutenant Masatsuka Fuji stood frozen on the ridge overlooking Lunga Point, binoculars pressed tightly against his face. What he witnessed made no logical sense. Approaching the beach at remarkable speed were strange, box-shaped vessels, dozens of them, churning through the shallow water with apparent disregard for the coral reefs that had long been considered Guadalcanal's natural defense. As each vessel touched sand, the front seemingly collapsed, revealing not a damaged craft but an ingenious ramp. Within seconds, fully armed American Marines charged directly onto the beach, bypassing the normally chaotic and vulnerable process of climbing over the sides. "Impossible," Fuji whispered to his radio man. "No landing craft can do this." But the evidence was undeniable. The Americans had solved the unsolvable problem of amphibious assault, and in that moment, Lieutenant Fuji understood that the strategic calculations of the entire Pacific War had just been fundamentally altered. What he couldn't know was that this revolution in warfare had come not from the U.S. Navy's engineering departments or prestigious shipbuilding companies, but from the determined mind of a profane, hard-drinking civilian boat builder from New Orleans with no formal education beyond high school. The vessel that shocked Lieutenant Fuji was the landing craft, vehicle, personnel, the LCVP, better known as the Higgins boat. And its creator, Andrew Jackson Higgins, would later be described by President Dwight D. Eisenhower as the man who won the war for us. Dermater, the problem of amphibious warfare. The year was 1934, and the United States Marine Corps faced an existential crisis. Their very purpose, amphibious operations, seemed increasingly impossible in the modern age. For centuries, landing troops on hostile shores had followed the same deadly pattern. Ships would anchor offshore, lowering rowboats filled with soldiers who would paddle to the beach, then climb over the sides of their boats under enemy fire, a process that routinely resulted in catastrophic casualties before a single shot was fired. Major General John H. Russell, Commandant of the Marine Corps, understood that Japan's rising aggression in the Pacific meant amphibious operations would be essential in any future conflict. But traditional naval architects had declared the challenge of creating an effective landing craft unsolvable. The competing requirements seemed mutually exclusive. A vessel needed deep draft for ocean travel, but shallow draft for beach landing. It needed to be small enough for maneuverability, but large enough to carry troops and equipment. It needed armor protection that inevitably increased weight and decreased speed. "The perfect landing craft is a fantasy," declared Admiral William D. Leahy in a 1936 meeting at the Navy Department. "We should focus our energies elsewhere." The Corps' Equipment Board, led by Major Ernest Linsert, disagreed. Desperate for solutions, they scoured civilian boat designs that might be adapted for military use. In late 1938, Linsert's team discovered unusual boats operating in the Louisiana bayous, shallow draft vessels used by oil companies and trappers to navigate the treacherous marshlands. These Eureka boats could operate in just 18 inches of water, reverse direction without backing up, and maneuver through dense obstacles. Their designer was a man who had never set foot in a college engineering program, but had spent his life mastering the challenges of shallow-water boat building. Andrew Jackson Higgins was born on August 28, 1886, in Columbus, Nebraska, about as far from ocean-going traditions as one could imagine. After a tumultuous youth that included multiple expulsions from school for fighting, Higgins moved to the South and eventually established Higgins Industries in New Orleans in 1930, initially focusing on lumber and boat building for the local market. By the time the Marine Corps discovered him, Higgins had already created a reputation for engineering solutions where traditional shipbuilders had failed. His personality was as unconventional as his designs. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with piercing blue eyes, Higgins was renowned for explosive profanity, prodigious bourbon consumption, and an absolute refusal to accept any limitation as permanent. Experts are just men who are afraid to try something new, Higgins once told a reporter. I've never met a problem that couldn't be solved by enough thought, enough whiskey, and enough determination. When Marine Corps representatives approached Higgins about adapting his Eureka boat for military use, they encountered not the eager compliance typical of military contractors, but a brash confidence that bordered on insubordination. Your Navy boys have been trying to solve this problem for years with all your fancy education, Higgins reportedly told the Marine procurement team. Why don't you just get out of my way and let me show you how it's done? Lieutenant Colonel Victor Krulak, sent to evaluate Higgins's operation, initially bristled at the boatbuilder's manner, but quickly recognized his genius. Higgins had an intuitive grasp of hydrodynamics that the Naval Academy's finest engineers couldn't match, Krulak later wrote. He thought in 3 dimensions and solved problems through a combination of experience and sheer force of will. The initial adaptation of Higgins's Eureka boat, designated landing craft, personnel, large, or LCPL, was promising but still required troops to climb over the gunwales. The breakthrough came in 1941, when Higgins learned of a Japanese landing boat captured in the 1937 invasion of Shanghai that featured a bow ramp. Without ever seeing the Japanese design, Higgins sketched his own version on the spot, reportedly on the back of a restaurant menu. "Get me back to the yard," he told his dinner companions. "I've just solved our problem." Within 1 month, Higgins had built a prototype featuring a bow ramp that could be lowered onto beaches, allowing troops to disembark directly onto shore. This design, which would evolve into the LCVP, wasn't just an incremental improvement. It represented a fundamental reconceptualization of amphibious warfare. Major General Holland M. Smith, who would later be known as the father of amphibious warfare, witnessed an early demonstration. "It's not just a better boat," Smith reportedly said. "It's an entirely new way of thinking about amphibious operations." Yet remarkably, even as late as 1940, the U.S. Navy continued to favor designs from traditional shipbuilders. It would take the personal intervention of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, himself a former Assistant Secretary of the Navy with a keen interest in naval architecture, to break through institutional resistance. After witnessing comparative trials where Higgins's boats consistently outperformed Navy-designed alternatives, Roosevelt reportedly pounded his fist on his wheelchair arm and declared, "This is what we need, and this man Higgins seems to be the only one who can give it to us." Industrial Revolution in New Orleans, December 18, 1941. New Orleans, Louisiana. Andrew Jackson Higgins slammed down the telephone receiver with such force that the entire desk shook. 11 days after Pearl Harbor, the call he had both expected and dreaded had come. The Navy wanted 724 landing craft, not in a year, not in 6 months, but immediately. "Get me every foreman on this property," Higgins barked to his secretary. "Then start calling people. Every carpenter, metal worker, and able-bodied person in New Orleans. We're going to war." Prior to America's entry into World War II, Higgins Industries employed just 75 people in a single boatyard. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary industrial transformations in American history. Within 6 months, Higgins had expanded to 7 production facilities and over 12,000 workers. By 1943, his workforce exceeded 20,000. The company that had once produced less than 50 boats annually was now completing one vessel every hour at peak production. This expansion required not just physical infrastructure, but a complete rethinking of production methods. Higgins, who had never set foot on a mass production assembly line, intuitively developed techniques that paralleled Henry Ford's automotive innovations. Boats had always been built one at a time by craftsmen, explained Norman Brower, naval historian at the South Street Seaport Museum. Higgins reimagined the entire process, breaking construction into standardized steps that could be performed by relatively unskilled workers, following clear instructions. The scale of this industrial revolution becomes clear through the numbers. Before the war, building a single boat required approximately 2,000 hours of labor. By 1943, Higgins had reduced this to just 1,200 hours, despite maintaining exceptional quality standards. Materials presented another seemingly insurmountable challenge. Traditional shipbuilding relied on seasoned hardwoods that were increasingly scarce. Higgins pioneered the use of veneer plywood, multiple layers of thin wood bonded with waterproof adhesives that could be rapidly produced from southern pine forests. This innovation alone cut production time by nearly 40%. Perhaps most revolutionary was Higgins's approach to workforce development. In the deeply segregated South, Higgins created the first fully integrated workforce in New Orleans, hiring based solely on ability, regardless of race or gender. African Americans held skilled positions and supervisory roles. Women made up nearly 30% of the workforce. Higgins paid equal wages for equal work decades before this became legally mandated. I don't care if they're black, white, male, female, or Martian, Higgins reportedly told his personnel manager. If they can do the job, hire them. We've got a war to win. This social revolution didn't come without resistance. When local officials threatened to enforce segregation laws at Higgins' facilities, the Boatbuilder's response was characteristically direct. You can take your Jim Crow laws and stick them where the sun doesn't shine. Either I run my company my way, or you can find someone else to build the boats that are winning this war. The officials backed down. By early 1942, the first mass-produced LCVPs were rolling off Higgins's assembly lines, but production faced a new threat. The Japanese conquest of rubber-producing regions in Southeast Asia created a critical shortage of this essential material needed for everything from gaskets to drive belts. Higgins responded by creating his own rubber manufacturing facility virtually overnight, producing synthetic rubber components when natural rubber became unavailable. This vertical integration, bringing all aspects of production under direct control, became another hallmark of Higgins Industries. Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, visited the Higgins operations in April 1942 and was astounded by what he witnessed. I have never seen anything like it, King wrote in his official report. Higgins has created not just a production facility, but an entirely new industrial ecosystem. From raw lumber to finished combat vessels, every stage occurs under his direct supervision with a speed and quality that our established shipyards cannot match. By mid-1942, Higgins Industries was producing 8 different naval vessel designs simultaneously: LCVPs, LCMs, landing craft, mechanized, PT boats, patrol torpedo boats, supply vessels, air-sea rescue craft, and other specialized designs. This diversity of production from a single company was unprecedented in naval history. The human drama behind this industrial miracle was captured in a 1943 Life magazine profile of the Higgins workforce. It described Mary Jackson, a 42-year-old African-American grandmother who had previously worked as a hotel maid, now operating complex hydraulic equipment with extraordinary precision. It told of Thomas Livaudais, a 16-year-old who lied about his age to join the workforce after his older brother was killed at Pearl Harbor. And it documented Andrew Higgins himself, working 20-hour days, sleeping on a cot in his office, driving his workforce through a combination of inspiration, intimidation, and sheer force of personality. The remarkable thing about Higgins, wrote the Life correspondent, is that he has somehow transferred his own sense of urgency to 20,000 individuals who collectively understand that lives depend on every boat that leaves their hands. Contractors, the machines of amphibious warfare. January 10, 1943. Camp Bradford, Virginia. The cold Atlantic spray drenched the huddled Marines as their LCVP approached the training beach. 19-year-old Private Robert Sullivan, like most of his companions, had never experienced a landing craft before boarding that morning. The vessel looked nothing like the sleek naval ships he had imagined when enlisting, just a boxy wooden craft with high gunwales and a mysterious front section. As the craft ground against sand, the coxswain shouted, "Prepare to land!" The front of the boat dropped down, transforming instantly into a ramp. "Go! Go! Go!" bellowed the instructor. Sullivan and 35 other fully equipped Marines charged directly onto the beach, moving from the relative protection of the boat to combat positions in seconds. "It was a revelation," Sullivan later wrote in his memoir. "We had expected to climb over the sides, to wade through deep water, to be completely vulnerable for long minutes. Instead, we were fighting ready the instant our boots hit sand." What Private Sullivan experienced that January morning was the culmination of decades of Marine Corps thinking about amphibious warfare, made possible by the specific engineering genius of the Higgins LCVP. The technical specifications of the LCVP reveal why it represented such a revolutionary advancement. At 36 feet long and 10 feet, 10 inches wide, the vessel could carry 36 fully equipped troops, or, alternatively, a jeep and 12 troops, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. The boat's draft, when fully loaded, was just 3 feet 8 inches, shallow enough to navigate over many reefs and obstacles. 2 diesel engines, generating 225 horsepower, gave the LCVP a top speed of 12 knots. These raw numbers, however, don't capture the design brilliance that made the LCVP so effective. Traditional naval architecture relied on rigid structures with predictable stress patterns. Higgins instead created a semi-flexible hull that could absorb the shock of beach landings and rough surf without structural failure. The hull featured a hollow keel that provided both strength and remarkable buoyancy. The propeller was protected in a semi-tunnel that prevented damage from underwater obstacles. Most revolutionary was the bow ramp, a seemingly simple concept that proved extraordinarily difficult to engineer effectively. The ramp needed to be watertight when raised, strong enough to support the weight of vehicles when lowered, and mechanically reliable under combat conditions. Higgins's solution was a counterweighted design that a single crew member could operate even if power systems failed. "The genius is in the simplicity," explained naval architect William Friedman of MIT in a 1945 analysis. Anyone examining a Higgins boat is struck not by complexity, but by how elegantly straightforward every system appears. This simplicity masked thousands of hours of problem-solving and refinement. The boat's construction method was equally innovative. The hull utilized plywood over a wooden frame, with each layer oriented to provide maximum strength with minimum weight. Critical stress points were reinforced with metal plates. This composite construction allowed for rapid production while maintaining durability under combat conditions. As 1943 began, these landing craft were flowing from Higgins Industries at an astonishing rate. The company was completing more than 700 vessels monthly, a production miracle that transformed the strategic calculations of Allied planning. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, captured this transformation in a confidential memorandum to President Roosevelt. The availability of landing craft is no longer the limiting factor in our amphibious operations. For the first time, we can plan based on tactical necessity rather than equipment constraints. For the men who would use these vessels in combat, the training process revealed both the LCVP's capabilities and its limitations. The boats were remarkably seaworthy, able to operate in surf conditions that would swamp conventional vessels. However, they were brutally uncomfortable in rough seas, with troops often becoming violently seasick during longer transits from transport ships to shore. Navy coxswains required specialized training to handle the unique characteristics of the LCVP. The shallow draft and twin propellers gave the craft exceptional maneuverability, but also made it sensitive to weight distribution and sea conditions. A skilled coxswain could beach the craft, discharge troops, and retract from the shore in under 2 minutes, a critical factor in survival under enemy fire. Lieutenant Commander William McLeish, who helped develop the training program for LCVP crews, emphasized the psychological factor. The boat itself became a weapon when operated correctly. A properly timed landing, with multiple craft hitting the beach simultaneously, created a shock effect that often overwhelmed defenders who had to face hundreds of combat-ready troops appearing as if by magic. The vessel's wooden construction, initially criticized as insufficiently protective compared to metal alternatives, proved to have unexpected advantages. Metal fragments from nearby explosions would not create secondary shrapnel, as would occur with steel hulls. Damage could be repaired quickly with simple tools and materials. Most importantly, the lightweight construction allowed for greater speed and maneuverability. For the Japanese forces encountering these craft for the first time, the psychological impact was profound. Imperial Japanese Navy Lieutenant Hisashi Nakahara, captured after the Battle of Tarawa, told interrogators, "We had been told American landing craft would be slowed by the reef, giving us time to concentrate fire on soldiers struggling through water. Instead, these wooden boats came directly onto the beach. There was no opportunity to engage troops in the water, as we had planned." First Blood, Guadalcanal, and the Proving Ground. August 7, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, Guadalcanal. Dawn revealed a sight unprecedented in the Pacific War. 82 transport and landing ships arranged in precise formation, disgorging smaller craft that began assembling in attack waves. Aboard the command ship USS Macaulay, Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, watched with contained anxiety as the first wave of Higgins boats formed up. The Guadalcanal landing represented the first major test of both the LCVP and the American amphibious doctrine it had helped create. Everything about the operation violated previously accepted limitations of amphibious warfare. The coral reefs surrounding the island would have been considered impenetrable barriers to landing craft just a year earlier. The distances from transport ships to shore, in some cases exceeding 10 miles, would have made conventional landing methods logistically impossible. "We are attempting something that the Japanese High Command believes cannot be done," Vandegrift told his staff the night before. "That belief is our greatest advantage." At precisely 09:10 hours, the first wave of 23 Higgins boats touched down on Red Beach. The bow ramps dropped in near-perfect synchronization, discharging over 700 Marines directly onto the shore. Within 15 minutes, 3 full battalions were ashore with their equipment, a rate of deployment that military observers from earlier eras would have deemed impossible. Captain Bernd Benson, commanding F Company, 5th Marines, later described the landing. "We expected chaos, casualties before even making shore. Instead, I found myself and my entire company on the beach, in formation, weapons ready, within seconds of touching shore. It was orderly, almost methodical. This thing that had always been considered the most dangerous and disorganized part of warfare. The Japanese defenders, primarily construction workers completing an airfield, were caught completely unprepared for the speed and scale of the American landing. By mid-afternoon, the Marines had secured a beachhead 2 miles deep and had captured the crucial airfield that would later be named Henderson Field. While the initial landing met minimal resistance, the true test of the Higgins boats came in subsequent days as Japanese naval forces contested control of the surrounding waters. On the night of August 8-9, the Battle of Savo Island resulted in one of the worst naval defeats in U.S. history, with 4 heavy cruisers sunk and over 1,000 sailors lost. The American transport fleet was forced to withdraw prematurely, taking with them much of the division's heavy equipment and supplies. What remained ashore were the Marines, their basic equipment, and critically, a substantial number of Higgins boats that had been beached on the island. These craft, originally designed for ship-to-shore operations, now became the division's maritime lifeline. Marines using the Higgins boats conducted coastal reconnaissance, transported supplies between beach positions, evacuated wounded, and even executed small raiding operations against Japanese positions. Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, utilized the Higgins boats to execute a surprise landing at Tasimboko on September 8th. His raiders, transported in 7 LCVPs, destroyed the headquarters of Japanese Colonel Akinosuke Oka, capturing vital intelligence and supplies. "The boats gave us an unexpected mobility," Edson later reported. "The Japanese were thinking in terms of fixed positions, of a static defensive line. We could appear anywhere along the coast almost at will." See, as the Guadalcanal campaign evolved into a desperate struggle for control of the island, the versatility of the Higgins boats repeatedly proved decisive. When Japanese destroyers began running supplies to their forces at night, the famous Tokyo Express, Marines utilized Higgins boats to monitor coastal areas, providing early warning of Japanese activities. The boat's shallow draft proved especially valuable when Japanese naval gunfire drove supply operations away from primary beaches. LCVPs could navigate through coral passages that larger vessels could not attempt, maintaining supply lines to isolated marine positions. By November 1942, the strategic importance of the Higgins boat had become clear to commanders throughout the Pacific. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces in the South Pacific, wrote to the Chief of Naval Operations, "The LCVP has proven itself not merely adequate, but essential to our island operations. I cannot overstate the tactical advantages these craft provide. Without them, our casualties would be catastrophic, and our strategy in the Pacific untenable." Lieutenant Howard Vander Beek felt the shuddering impact as his LCVP touched down on the sand of Omaha Beach. Through the splash guard, he could see the apocalyptic scene ahead, a narrow strip of beach already littered with bodies and disabled equipment. German MG-42 machine guns swept the shoreline with devastating crossfire, while artillery rounds exploded in geysers of sand and seawater. "Drop ramp!" Vander Beek ordered, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony of battle. As the bow ramp splashed into the shallow surf, the 29 soldiers of E Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division surged forward into the maelstrom. The entire disembarkation took less than 8 seconds. Vander Beek immediately ordered, "Retract!" and the coxswain expertly reversed the craft back into deeper water, narrowly avoiding a mortar round that exploded where they had been moments before. This scene repeated itself more than 3,000 times across 5 invasion beaches on D-Day, as over 4,000 Allied landing craft, most of them Higgins boats, delivered 156,000 men directly onto Hitler's Atlantic Wall. It was the largest amphibious operation in history, made possible by a New Orleans boat builder who had reimagined what was possible in amphibious warfare. The Normandy landings represented the ultimate test of the Higgins boat and the amphibious doctrine it had enabled. Unlike Pacific Island assaults, where naval gunfire could largely suppress enemy positions, the Atlantic Wall featured concrete bunkers impervious to all but direct hits from battleship guns. The Germans had fortified the coastline with over 500,000 obstacles specifically designed to destroy landing craft. Steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, concrete tetrahedrons, and thousands of mines. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had correctly identified landing craft as the critical vulnerability in any invasion attempt. The enemy must be defeated on the beaches, he had instructed his commanders. That is the only place where his superior armaments cannot be brought fully to bear. What Rommel could not have anticipated was how the Higgins boat's unique characteristics would undermine his defensive strategy. The LCVP's shallow draft allowed it to navigate between many obstacle belts. Its wooden hull was less vulnerable to magnetic mines designed for metal-hulled vessels. Most importantly, its speed and bow ramp design reduced the time soldiers were exposed on the beach from minutes to seconds. Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, official U.S. Army historian at Normandy, wrote, "The decisive factor was not firepower or numbers, but the speed of deployment. Higgins boats delivered combat-ready units directly onto the beaches. Where soldiers could exit rapidly in tactical formations, they succeeded. Where landing craft faltered or forced soldiers to wade through deep water, the results were catastrophic." The human experience of those Normandy landings revealed the transformation of amphibious warfare that Higgins had made possible. Private Vincent Corsini of the 29th Infantry Division described his landing on Omaha Beach. "In training, they told us the ramp would drop and we'd run out in seconds. When it actually happened, with bullets hitting the ramp as it dropped, those seconds felt like salvation. Men from earlier wars would have been hanging off the sides, easy targets. We had a fighting chance because of how quickly we could get off that boat." U.S. Navy records document that 441 Higgins boats were lost or severely damaged during the D-Day operations. Yet this seemingly high number represented an extraordinary success. Over 90% of all LCVPs completed their missions, despite facing the most formidable coastal defenses ever constructed. Had the landing craft suffered the casualty rates historically associated with amphibious operations, the invasion might have failed entirely. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognized this achievement. In a classified after-action report, he wrote, "The LCVP has proven itself the most essential single piece of equipment employed in the European operation. Without the Higgins boat, the landings would have been impossible under the planned conditions." What Eisenhower understood, and what the Germans learned too late, was that Andrew Higgins had fundamentally changed the mathematics of amphibious assault. Historical casualty rates for attackers in amphibious operations typically exceeded 50% in the landing phase alone. At Normandy, despite fierce resistance, overall landing casualties were held to less than 10%, a rate that made large-scale amphibious operations strategically viable. For the men who rowed the Higgins boats into combat, the experience left indelible memories. Sergeant Thomas Valance of the 1st Infantry Division recalled, "Those boats saved countless lives simply through their design. The coxswains could bring us closer to shore than any previous landing craft. The ramp meant we didn't have to expose ourselves climbing over gunwales. Every feature represented seconds saved under fire, and seconds meant lives." Back in New Orleans, Andrew Higgins received news of the D-Day landings with characteristic intensity. According to witnesses, he gathered his factory workers and announced, "Today, the boats you built are delivering our boys to the beaches of France. Every vessel that reaches shore, every ramp that drops successfully, every soldier who steps onto that beach ready to fight, that's on you. That's what you've done. By June 1944, Higgins Industries had produced over 20,000 landing craft of various designs. The company operated 7 production facilities working around the clock, employing over 25,000 workers. At peak production, a completed LCVP rolled off the assembly line every hour, a manufacturing achievement unprecedented in maritime construction. The industrial scale of this accomplishment can be measured in raw numbers. Higgins boats transported approximately 90% of all Allied troops that landed on hostile shores during World War II, a figure that represents millions of men delivered directly into combat. Without this capacity for rapid, large-scale amphibious deployment, the island-hopping Pacific campaign and the cross-channel invasion of Europe would have been logistically impossible. German Admiral Karl Dönitz, who succeeded Hitler as head of state, acknowledged this reality in his post-war interrogation. The American ability to deliver overwhelming forces onto hostile shores represented a capability we could neither match nor counter. Once we lost control of our coastal waters, we had no effective defense against their landing craft. What made this industrial miracle even more remarkable was that it came not from established shipbuilders or major defense contractors, but from a cantankerous, self-educated entrepreneur working outside traditional military-industrial channels. Higgins had no naval architecture training, no government connections, and no experience with mass production when the war began. What he possessed instead was an intuitive understanding of what was possible and an absolute refusal to accept conventional limitations. The strategic consequences of Higgins's innovation extended far beyond specific battles. By making large-scale amphibious operations viable, the LCVP removed the primary constraint on Allied strategy. Military planners no longer needed to limit operations to locations with port facilities or natural harbors. Any beach became a potential invasion site, a transformation that forced Axis powers to defend entire coastlines rather than concentrating on likely landing points. This dispersal of defensive resources proved decisive in both European and Pacific theaters. In the Mediterranean, Allied amphibious capabilities enabled landings in North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, and southern France, each operation forcing German commanders to divert precious resources from other fronts. In the Pacific, the island-hopping strategy that ultimately brought Allied forces to Japan's doorstep would have been impossible without reliable landing craft available in sufficient numbers. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, captured this strategic impact in a 1945 assessment. Without the Higgins boat, the whole strategy of the Pacific War would have been different. We would have been forced to focus on capturing established ports rather than conducting direct assaults on strategic islands. The additional time this would have required might have extended the war by years. The mathematics of this strategic advantage became clear through production figures. By war's end, Higgins Industries and its licensees had produced over 23,000 landing craft of various designs. Japan and Germany combined produced fewer than 2,000 comparable vessels. This disparity created an insurmountable strategic advantage. Allied commanders could contemplate operations requiring hundreds or thousands of landing craft, while Axis forces struggled to defend against this amphibious flexibility. German General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the Wehrmacht, admitted after the war, "We knew the invasion would come, but the scale of their landing capability exceeded our most pessimistic estimates. When thousands of landing craft appeared off Normandy, we recognized that no defensive line could withstand such concentrated deployment power." For Andrew Jackson Higgins, the war brought both triumph and tragedy. His company expanded from 75 employees to over 20,000 in less than 2 years. Annual revenue grew from under $1 million to over $300 million. A growth rate unprecedented in American industrial history. Higgins became a national figure, featured on magazine covers and newsreels as a symbol of American industrial might. Yet this very success contained the seeds of later difficulties. The rapid expansion created enormous financial strains as Higgins invested personal funds and took on debt to build new facilities. The company's workforce integration policies, though visionary, created tension with local officials in the segregated South. Perhaps most significantly, Higgins's outspoken nature and confrontational style made enemies in Washington bureaucracy who would remember perceived slights after the war ended. As victory approached in 1945, military contracts began to be canceled. Higgins Industries, which had grown entirely on wartime production, faced an uncertain future. Andrew Higgins attempted to convert his facilities to civilian manufacturing, developing plans for innovative prefabricated housing, commercial vessels, and even a revolutionary automobile design. But the transition proved difficult, and government priorities shifted to other industries and regions. By 1947, Higgins Industries had shrunk to a fraction of its wartime size. The company that had once employed over 20,000 people struggled to keep 2,000 on payroll. The 7 massive production facilities were sold off or repurposed. The man who had created one of the most significant military innovations in naval history found himself fighting bankruptcy. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, largely forgotten by the public and government he had served so effectively. His passing received modest coverage in maritime publications but little national attention. The man President Eisenhower would later call the man who won the war for us was buried without military honors or official recognition. The true significance of Higgins's contribution would only be fully recognized decades later, as military historians began reassessing the critical factors in Allied victory. Naval historian Barrett Tillman wrote in 1990, "No single piece of equipment, not the atomic bomb, not the Jeep, not even the aircraft carrier, contributed as much to winning World War II as did the Higgins boat." See, the legacy of Andrew Jackson Higgins extends beyond the specific vessels he created. His approach to industrial production, emphasizing standardization, simplified designs, and leveraging semi-skilled labor, transformed how military equipment could be manufactured. The integrated workforce he created in segregated Louisiana demonstrated that production efficiency and social progress could advance simultaneously. Perhaps most significantly, his willingness to challenge conventional military thinking showed how civilian innovation could revolutionize warfare. Today, every modern amphibious vessel, whether military or civilian, incorporates design elements pioneered by Higgins. The bow ramp, once considered his most revolutionary innovation, is now standard on landing craft worldwide. The semi-tunnel protecting the propeller is found on vessels ranging from pleasure boats to commercial ferries. The composite construction techniques he pioneered prefigured modern shipbuilding methods by decades. In 2023, 80 years after the Higgins boats stormed the beaches of Normandy, only a handful of original LCVPs remain. Most were scrapped immediately after the war, their wooden construction making them difficult to preserve. The few surviving examples reside in museums, silent witnesses to how one man's determination changed the course of global conflict. Perhaps the most fitting testament to Andrew Higgins comes from the millions of veterans who rowed his boats into combat. As one D-Day survivor put it, "We never met the man, but we trusted his boats with our lives. They delivered us to the beaches, and by doing that job well, They delivered victory.